Ah, welcome, dear traveller in time. Whether you're curled up in a dimly lit study, a candle flickering beside you, or perhaps tucked into bed with the soft glow of a screen casting long shadows across your walls, I do hope wherever you are listening from tonight, the hum of the world outside is quiet enough to let my voice drift in without too much interruption. If you'd like, you might pause for a moment and think about where that is. The rustle of autumn leaves against a window pane, the distant murmur of traffic, or maybe just the stillness of a room shared with only your thoughts. I'll wait. Somewhere in the ancient Mediterranean, perhaps around 400 BCE, give or take a few decades, the daughter of a Hellenic king would have been doing much the same, pausing between tasks to let the mind wander, to imagine what lay beyond the familiar routines. She was waiting, of course, waiting for her suitor's return, though the word asterisk suitor might make it sound like she was expecting a gentleman caller with roses in hand and poetry on his lips. In truth, she was waiting for her husband-to-be, a man whose coming would bind two families together politically, economically, and socially. And if you're picturing something out of a romance novel, well, I'm afraid I must gently correct that image before we go any further. There were no grand ballrooms where Greek princesses languished over tea, waiting for the hero to ride in on his white steed, at least not in the way most people imagine it. No, the reality was far more mundane, far more practical, and dare I say, far more asterisk real asterisk. The life of a Greek princess wasn't one of endless embroidery and passive waiting. It was one of careful navigation through the expectations of her family, the constraints of her society, and the very real need to ensure that when her husband did arrive, she would be a valuable asset rather than an embarrassment. So, if you'll indulge me, let's step into the sandals of such a young woman, perhaps a daughter of the Macedonian court under Philip II or one of the lesser Hellenic city-states, and see what a day in her life actually looked like. She would have risen with the sun, or perhaps a little later if she was fortunate enough to have servants who could rouse her gently. The first thing she'd notice would be the light, not the soft, golden glow of a modern morning, but something harsher, more direct, painting the sky in shades of pale blue and white. The air would carry the scent of salt if she lived near the sea, or perhaps the earthier aroma of olive groves or vineyards if her home was inland. Inside the house, asterisk oikos asterisk, would have been bustling with activity. Slaves would be stirring hearths to life, drawing water from wells, and preparing the day's meals. She wouldn't have had much privacy. Even in the most modest households, space was shared, and personal time was a luxury reserved for those who could afford it. Her morning routine would begin with ablutions, washing her face, brushing her hair if she had any to speak of, and perhaps applying a bit of scent. Greek women didn't wear perfume like modern cosmetics. It was more about oils, some infused with lavender or myrrh, that they'd anoint their skin and hair with. These weren't just for vanity. The oils also served practical purposes, keeping the hair smooth, protecting the skin from sun or wind, and even signaling one's status. A princess wouldn't have used the cheap, locally made concoctions. Hers would have come from the finest workshops in Athens or Sparta, perhaps even imported from Egypt if her father had the connections. Then came the dressing part, though asterisk dressing asterisk isn't quite the right word for it. Greek women wore a simple chiton, a rectangular piece of fabric draped and belted at the waist, often layered with a hamadeion, a sort of shawl or cloak. That could be wrapped around the body in various ways, depending on the weather or occasion. For a princess, the fabrics would have been fine linen or even silk if she was especially lucky, dyed in deep purples or rich crimsons that spoke to her status. She wouldn't have had a vast array of gowns like some later European queens. Fashion wasn't about individual expression, but about adhering to the standards set by one's community. A princess might own 3 or 4 outfits, each chosen for its appropriate setting. One for household duties, another for public appearances, and perhaps a more elaborate one for festivals or when her father entertained dignitaries. After dressing, she'd probably take a light breakfast. Figs, olives, maybe some bread dipped in honey or wine, though the wine would be watered down to something closer to modern-day grape juice. Eating alone wasn't encouraged. Even princesses were expected to share meals with their families or guests if present. Then, the day's responsibilities would begin. Her role as a future bride was not one of waiting in idleness, but of preparing herself for the responsibilities she'd inherit. She'd have been educated, not just in the basics of reading and writing, though those were important, but in music, weaving, and the finer points of household management. Greek women didn't typically run households alone unless they were widows, or in some cases, ruling queens like Pericles' daughter, but they were expected to know how to supervise slaves, negotiate with merchants, and keep accounts. A princess might spend part of her morning practicing the lyre or singing hymns, not because she loved it, but because it was considered a lady's accomplishment, much like knowing how to recite poetry or debate philosophy in a polite, mannered way. She'd also have been learning about politics, indirectly. Her father would have discussed matters of state with her mother or other female relatives, assuming her to be too young to contribute. But she would have listened, absorbing the dynamics of power, the importance of alliances, and the careful balance between diplomacy and force. She wouldn't have had a seat at the council table, but she'd know who in her future husband's court held influence and how best to navigate those relationships once she was there. Mid-morning might bring her to the Gynaeceum asterisk, the women's quarter of the household, a place that, despite its name, which simply means women's domain, wasn't as secluded as one might think. It was where women worked, spun wool, woven fabrics, and managed the household's day-to-day operations. Here, she'd find her mother, aunts, perhaps even grandmothers if they were still alive. They'd be discussing the latest news from other cities, planning for upcoming festivals, or perhaps debating the best way to prepare a particular dish for an important guest. The Gynaeceum wasn't a place of isolation. It was a hub of social and economic activity where women played crucial roles in maintaining the family's status. Afternoon would bring more practical tasks, overseeing the preparation of meals, inspecting the work of slaves or craftsmen if she came from a wealthy enough household, or perhaps taking a walk outside if the weather permitted. Greek women weren't confined to the indoors as much as some later societies would be. They could move freely within the city, visit markets, and even attend festivals, though always under the chaperone of a relative or slave escort. She'd have been expected to make appearances in public, at religious ceremonies, at symposia, though these were often male-dominated spaces where her role would have been limited, or when her family received visitors. One thing she wouldn't have done is spend her time pining over a lost love. The concept of romantic love, as we understand it, was largely foreign to ancient Greek culture, especially in the context of marriage. Marriages were arranged for political reasons, and while affection could certainly develop between partners, it wasn't the driving force behind the union. Her focus would have been on being a good daughter first, obedient, respectful, and always mindful of how her actions reflected on her family's honor. Only later, once she was married, would her primary loyalty shift to her husband's household. Evenings were for rest, or at least the illusion of it. If her father had guests, she might be called upon to perform, to entertain with music or dance, though these performances were rarely for personal enjoyment. They were part of the ritual of hospitality. If there was a symposium, she wouldn't have been invited to drink wine. That was strictly a male affair. But she might sit nearby, weaving or observing the proceedings. She'd learn early that her role in such gatherings wasn't to participate, but to be seen, another way for her family's status to be displayed. As for her suitor, the man who would one day arrive and claim her as his bride, he wouldn't have been some dashing hero on a grand adventure. He might not even have been a stranger. Many marriages were arranged between families within the same region, with the young people meeting only briefly before the wedding. If he came from another city, he'd likely be accompanied by envoys or relatives who would negotiate the terms of the marriage in advance. The dowry, if any, the political obligations, and perhaps even the timing. The princess wouldn't have had much say in who her husband was. That decision rested with her father and the other men in her family. When the asterisk did arrive, it wouldn't be with fanfare like a modern wedding procession. There might be a simple ceremony at her home, perhaps an exchange of gifts, a libation poured to the guards, and then, well, life would continue much as before, but now under her husband's authority. She'd move to his household, or he might come live with hers, depending on the arrangement, and her daily routine would adjust to fit his needs and those of his family. So, what was she doing while waiting? Not daydreaming about love, certainly not in the way we imagine it today. She was learning, preparing, and biding her time, waiting not for a man, but for the moment when her life would transition from being a daughter to being a wife, and eventually, perhaps a mother or even a queen in her own right. And now, as you sit there, listening to this, I wonder, are you waiting too? Waiting for something, perhaps a better day, a better job, a relationship that feels like more than just an obligation. Maybe you're waiting for the past to make sense, to feel like it connects to your present in some meaningful way. If so, you're not alone. The princesses of ancient Greece were waiting too, though their waiting was different from ours. They weren't waiting for love or happiness. They were waiting for duty. But let me ask you this. Is there any true happiness that doesn't come with some form of responsibility? Perhaps the difference between then and now is that we've learned to romanticize the waiting, that we imagine it as a time of possibility, of dreams yet to be realized. The Greek princesses didn't have that luxury. Their waiting was tied to something far more concrete, the survival of their families, the stability of their cities, the very fabric of power in a world where women's lives were measured not by personal fulfillment, but by their contribution to something larger than themselves. So tonight, as you sit in your own world, wherever that may be, perhaps take a moment to think about what you are waiting for. Is it something you can control? Or is it, like the princess's fate, something that will unfold according to forces beyond your reach? But enough of that. Let's return to our princess. There's still more to her story, even if it's not quite as glamorous as you might have hoped. The next part of her day would involve physical labor, not the kind that leaves one sweaty and exhausted, but the steady, quiet work of maintaining one's image and reputation. She'd spend time with her mother or aunts, practicing the art of asterisk sophrosine asterisk, self-control, decorum, something that was just as important for a princess as it was for the men in her family. She'd learn to speak when spoken to ask the right questions at the right times, and to never let her emotions show unless they were carefully calculated. She might also take time to practice her weaving or other domestic crafts, not because she loved it, but because it was expected of her. A woman's worth in ancient Greece wasn't measured by how much land she owned or how many laws she could pass. It was measured by her ability to manage a household efficiently and produce high-quality goods. So if you've ever thought that embroidery is just for decoration, think again. It was one of the most prestigious skills a Greek woman could master, and a princess would be expected to excel at it. Lunchtime would come, simple affair. Bread, perhaps some cheese or olives, maybe a bit of grilled fish if her household had access to fresh seafood. She'd eat with other women, discussing the day's events, who had come to visit, what gifts were exchanged, who might be arriving soon. These conversations weren't idle chatter. They were intelligence gathering in their own way. A princess needed to know who was allied with whom, who held favor with her father, and who might pose a threat if she wasn't careful. After lunch, it's possible she'd take a nap, though whether it was out of exhaustion or just the Greek habit of siesta is hard to say. The Greeks didn't have our modern concept of always being productive. They valued leisure as much as work, and even a princess would have been expected to know when to rest. The afternoon might bring more formal duties. If her father had guests, a political ally, perhaps, or a foreign dignitary, she'd be called upon to make an appearance. These weren't social visits in the modern sense. They were state occasions where every gesture, every word, carried weight. She'd sit quietly while men discussed matters of war and trade, listening carefully, knowing that her future husband's family would scrutinize how she behaved, how she held herself, whether she was a suitable match for their son. There might be moments when she could slip away, perhaps to the gardens if she had any, or to the temple if she felt the need for solitude. But even these escapes were not without purpose. They were places where she could practice her prayers, reflect on her role, and perhaps, if she was very lucky, find a quiet corner to herself. As evening approached, the household would grow more active. Slaves would be preparing dinner, a feast if guests were present, but still a meal of shared bread and wine for everyone else. If her suitor's envoys had arrived ahead of him, they'd be there too, and she'd need to be on her best behavior, charming without being overly familiar, respectful without seeming subservient. Then, after the meal, there might be entertainment, music, dance, perhaps even a bit of drama if she lived in a city with a strong cultural life. But again, this wasn't for her pleasure. It was for the guests' approval. She, deeper form as she was taught, knowing that her grace would reflect on her family's honor. Finally, night would fall. She'd retire to her quarters, perhaps not alone if her household was small or if custom dictated she share with other women, but certainly to a space that offered some respite from the day's duties. There she might read, if she was literate, perhaps a bit of Homer or Hesiod, or maybe she'd just lie awake, thinking about what lay ahead. And so her waiting would continue, day after day, month after month, until the moment arrived when her husband came home. Would it feel like a grand adventure? Probably not. It would be more likely to feel like the natural progression of life, one stage giving way to another, obligations shifting from father's house to husband's. But let me ask you this, is there any true romance in that? Or is the real story, the one we're often too distracted by glamour to see, about the quiet strength it took to navigate a world where your worth wasn't measured by who you loved, but by what you could contribute? I'll leave that for you to ponder as I sign off. Wherever you are listening from tonight, may your nights be peaceful and your days interesting. And if you ever find yourself waiting for love, for change, for something better, remember that the princesses of old were waiting too, though their waiting looked very different than ours does now. Good night.